Climate change is a serious threat to vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities. Not only is health compromised, but also food security, sanitation, and even the infrastructure they need to survive. The ASEAN Disabilities Forum strives to ensure the OPDs' involvement in the implementation of the ASEAN Enabling Masterplan 2025, which includes climate change issue. In that regard, ADF collected data from ASEAN countries, trained a community on climate change, and held discussions involving women with disabilities, indigenous and youth groups. Brunei Darussalam. Despite major commitments, Brunei Darussalam's nationally determined contributions continue to exclude the most vulnerable groups, like indigenous peoples and people with disabilities. Climate change is frequently related to disaster risk reduction. However, there is very little scope to include disability on the primary agenda. Cambodia. Cambodia's Climate Change Strategic Plan for Gender and Climate Change, 2013 to 2023, does not contain equitable involvement for women, who are the most vulnerable. The Disaster Management Act of 2015 specifically addresses the requirements of women, children, the elderly, and those with disabilities. Indonesia. The Indonesian government approved Regulation 79/2014 on disaster and energy. The Indonesian Nationally Determined Contribution Roadmap included objectives for reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well as a commitment to net absorption of forestry and other land use by 2030. However, the opinions and involvement of people with disabilities in the Indonesian NDC are neglected. Lao PDR. The Lao People's Democratic Republic has created a national green growth strategy as 2030. Unfortunately, current national legislation and policies do not adequately address the rights of vulnerable populations. In addition, the Lao Nationally Determined Contribution Report makes no mention of the disability groups. Other vulnerable groups, such as women and indigenous peoples, also unheard. Malaysia. The Malaysian government has limited policies on climate change. The existing national policy on climate change in Malaysia consists of objectives, principles, and key actions, but does not mention disability issues. Myanmar. Myanmar has shown progress, but flexible policies are needed, particularly for social inclusion. Myanmar's climate change policies aim to reduce vulnerability and disproportionate impacts on its citizens, including persons with disabilities, such as rising sea levels, typhoons, and floods. Philippines. The Philippines has implemented a loss and damage policy. However, there is a shortage of data on disability and climate change and incompatibility with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Furthermore, the revised Magna Carta for Disabled Persons lacks social inclusion and focuses on climate change and catastrophe response strategies. Thailand. Thailand has had a climate change master plan from 2015 to 2020, but it was still trapped in legal uncertainty. The existing reports, although covering various important aspects, do not mention persons with disabilities at all, and even worse, neglect the most vulnerable groups, including those living below the poverty line, the elderly, pregnant women, and people with marginal livelihoods. Singapore. Singapore launched its Climate Action Plan in 2016, which outlines 4 targets for adapting to the effects of climate change, including adopting strategies to preserve coastal regions and infrastructure. However, Singapore's Climate Action Plan and Green Plan 2030 do not include any explicit measures for people with disabilities. Adequate measures are required to guarantee that their involvement in climate change initiatives is meaningful. Vietnam. Vietnam has used social inclusion principles to guarantee that vulnerable communities are represented in climate change policies. They accepted the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan for 2021 to 2030, as well as the National Climate Adaptation Strategy for 2050. These policies emphasize gender equality and women's empowerment. However, there are currently insufficient disaster response programs for persons with disabilities. It is time for Southeast Asia to make a substantial commitment, tangible actions in complete compliance with global agreements of inclusive climate change. The ASEAN Enabling Masterplan 2025, mainstreaming the rights of persons with disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or CRPD, and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, shall serve as primary guides. The strategy of social inclusion should be key to this effort, addressing any barriers encountered by people with disabilities, women, children, indigenous communities, and marginalized groups. Presented by ASEAN Disability Forum, supported by Disability Rights Advocacy Fund and Global Green Grants Fund.